Let's talk about SQLAlchemy. In the previous video, we talked about working with frameworks and working with libraries. And when I was giving an example of frameworks in Python, I mentioned SQLAlchemy. And that is partly correct, but there's a difference that we have to note here. We have two types of SQLAlchemy. There's SQLAlchemy Core and there's SQLAlchemy ORM. When I talk about libraries, SQLAlchemy Core is a Python library, while SQLAlchemy ORM is a Python framework. That is the major difference between the two. But let's just dive a little bit deeper into this to understand what you mean by core and ORM. SQLAlchemy Core, because it is a library, it gives you more control. So think of this as basically SQL fast. Think of it as SQL fast control. So you have to define your own controls with SQL code that you're going to write. But with SQLAlchemy ORM, because it is an ORM stands for Object Relational Mapper. This is an object mapper. And as we know in Python, there's, of course, even in JavaScript, we have objects and we have classes, right? So classes are what we refer to as the blueprints for creating an object, while objects are instances of a class. Now, because you're working with the ORM, that means you'll have to work with classes so that you can create the objects that you want. When you're working with SQLAlchemy ORM, here you'll work with Python classes. So you have to create a lot of Python classes to help you in defining these objects that are needed here. But the core difference between the two is that with ORM, you don't have that much control. You're just plugging into the framework itself. But with SQLAlchemy Core, you have all the control that you need. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper again. Whenever you're working with Python, there's always, you already know we have Fast API, and we also have Django, right? And whenever you want to work with SQLAlchemy, if you want to work with Fast API, this is where you deal with sessions. So if you've worked with Fast API, you've already worked with sessions. You already know how those work. Then when you work with Django, Django usually ships its own ORM. Django ships its own ORM. However, you can also plug in your own SQLAlchemy Core or your own SQLAlchemy ORM into your Django project. But it's usually not advisable. Django usually just wants you to plug in and use their own ORM. And that is literally the difference between SQLAlchemy Core and SQLAlchemy ORM. If you don't understand what all this is, I'd advise you to go and read the Django documentation. It explains all of these things. Just go and search for SQLAlchemy. It will show you the differences between these two. Happy coding.